I want to talk about work we've been doing in places around the world, about the prospects or the potentialities or the potencies of that. And I also want to talk a little bit about permaculture in this understanding that we have of providing refuge for all. Because as with decoloniality, the idea of refuge is not something that really, in a narrow way, I think needs to be reserved for people seeking asylum, although that is a very important and legal distinction. But actually, everybody needs a place of safety and sanctuary, a place of initial welcome, but also enduring well-being. Everybody needs a source to go to draw from in the work that they are doing, and that these practices of refuge, as practices of well-being, of nurturing and sustaining well-being, are ones that politicians are beginning to get interested in. You know, there's talk of well-being budgets and well-being economies. And whilst my work is not directly referencing that, it is working in traditions of hospitality, of sanctuary, that are about saying in quite determined ways that there are places where we can be gentle and merciful to one another. There are places where we can wrap one another's wounds, which are considerable. And there are places where our work might look different. But to do that, we're going to have to think beyond policy boxes and beyond the normal conventions. And we're going to have to, those of us who are part of traditions which have been articulating and instituting many different violences over generations, we will need to be humble and learn from those who have learned to survive that violence that our people might have generated, or those who we have elected to power might have generated. So that's a little bit of context around this. And you can see there a picture on my screen of an image of two people dancing on a fiddle. It's a little cutout from a mural that was painted during COP26 in our own education building. And it was just such a joyful thing to see. We all got involved in painting it and making this sign and symbol of collective restorative practice in place that was really hopeful about the prospects for refuge, a refuge in climate, a refuge in the environment, a refuge in the city of Glasgow at that time, a refuge for Indigenous people and for all those Indigenous people who've sought refuge elsewhere. The principles that I have to work with within the UNESCO chair at the University of Glasgow come from the preamble written over 75 years ago in the UNESCO Declaration, principles around intercultural dialogue, which say that if wars are made in the minds of people, then it's in the minds of people that the defences of peace must be constructed. So the work that we do, this understanding of restorative integration in places, the prospects, those elements that I've just spoken of, are very much understood as being about building the defences of peace. I would love us not have to use the word defense in the work of peace, that maybe that peace building was normative, was the air we breathed. But sadly, we're living in a context where that's not the case, where there is a militant aggression towards those who would make peace, and where the arms trade is the world's largest industry, and where we are dealing with the fallout, the wounds and the absolute horror that is experienced by people worldwide when we do not attend to the defences of peace. But our work within education, and particularly within education that comes under the auspices of UNESCO, is work with the minds of people to construct the defences of peace. And this is going on at a time, particularly in the United Kingdom, when, as Filippo Grandi, who is the UNHCR commissioner, so the commissioner for refugees worldwide, sees the United Kingdom, yes, and we can contest this, as a place which prides itself on its long history of welcoming and protecting refugees, but also where the United Nations commissioner for refugees, but also for human rights, are both disappointed in the United Kingdom, disappointed that the United Kingdom is choosing a course of action aimed at deterring the seeking of asylum by relegating most refugees to a new and lesser status with fewer rights and the constant threat of removal. Yesterday, I joined the cross-party group on migration in the Scottish Parliament, which is convened by members of different political parties to listen to the implications of the Illegal Migration Act, which has come into force, which isn't yet fully in force, and where we are waiting for the results of the Supreme Court's rulings, which begins to sit next week, and where we will hear in November what the appeal to the Supreme Court by the government is on the so-called Rwanda deal. But make no mistake, my friends, the UK has passed a law that takes it out of the Refugee Convention, and which will be a flagrant disregard of human rights. And that leaves us as scholars needing to think about what we do when rights are disrespected so egregiously, and what other recourses we might have, and what survival looks like, and how fragile our trust in rights might be. And leads again to me asking questions of what restorative integration might be. I want to give you a little bit of theory for the next few slides around this work that we're doing, and thinking about it with thinkers who've thought about these kinds of times which share a similar, what Raymond Williams has called structure of feeling, to the times that we are experiencing right now in the UK and in many other countries globally. And the first quote is from Hannah Arendt, beloved of many a scholar, particularly many a liberal scholar who has held to rights as a possibility. So there are many issues and problems with her work. But one of the things she said in her essay of, I think it was 1942, but I am sure that some of you online will correct me, who will have a better memory for dates. But after she'd arrived in New York and been granted asylum as a refugee, Hannah Arendt, a Jewish scholar who escaped the Holocaust, said, apparently, no one wants to know that contemporary history has created a new kind of human being, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and internment camps by their friends. And I've been thinking about this as we think about the Bibi Stockholm and the use of military sites for detention of people who tried to claim asylum and now are being refused the right of asylum in the UK. And that we are now seeing, yes, what have been concentration camps in poor, what now might be called concentration camps, but which have moved from being internment camps. We might have seen internment camps as being, these places where people were warehoused while they were waiting for their claims to be determined, really substandard accommodation or some detention centres, but whilst appeals were ongoing. But when all those appeal rights are removed, as they have been in the Illegal Migration Act, then we are led to having to understand these contexts as more like concentration camps, as bearing similar, not the same. The Holocaust was imprescriptible, as we say, never to be repeated, rather like the African genocide that was slavery. It is not that we are making comparisons to these, but we are seeing structures that are in place that bear traces of that kind of what Achille Mbembe has called necropolitics, and which I'm also seeing as a necroethics, a way in which those in power will say they have a moral right to bring into being these kinds of practices, and will appeal to, quotes, stopping criminal gangs, or quotes, smashing criminal gangs, or stopping the evil traffickers. So they'll use this very morally laden language as really something of a smokescreen to do something that really is a flagrant breach of human rights legislation and international law. And I'm using that language of a flagrant breach drawn directly from lawyers working in this field and speaking in these areas. Also mindful that much of what has been put in place is probably unworkable, and that we really are needing many of the legal remedies that we're seeing taken forward at the same time as we try and create places of survival. So necropolitics, necroethics, the institution of ethics and politics, which will lead to the deaths of many and to the harms to many as a policy, and which at the moment I see very much as leading to a situation where people are left with no choice but to choose between different harms that might be done to themselves. And that is the situation structurally where people are left. So this is a hard place to be. And it's also a hard place to be in terms of securitization and the professional discourses bred often in the academy around studies of securitization that are being used in the way we talk about what we do, but also the way policymakers talk about what they do and want to put into practice. This is an image that I took in 2016 when I was with a group of people from the Home Affairs and Select Committee in the Calais camps, so members of Parliament, whose job it is to decide and to make laws around or to oppose laws, as was the case with many of those visiting, with regard to the seeking of sanctuary. So this is the Calais camp. I think it's, for those of you who are geographers or who study securitization, it's a very interesting image. So what you have here are the agentic spaces. So these little houses that have been built out of what lies around, these improvised spaces, where we also saw people selling tomatoes, and they were all proudly lined up and organized and looked really pretty inside their shops and inside their places of living. And people liked these, they wanted to live in these. And then these spaces, which are containers. The container being a symbol par excellence of the mobility of goods under capitalism. Yes, needing a certain degree of licensing, but actually able to cross continents and cross borders with a degree of ease that is not accorded to bodies. And these were set up, these behind the fences, these containers were bought brand new by the French government to detain people who had lived in these tents that they'd built for themselves. They were placed often 14 to a container in these places and required to scan their biometrics in and out as part of a whole raft of measures of securitization. So what we see here is, the symbols of globalization and mobility par excellence for objects being used to create paralysis and stasis and detention and lack of movement around human bodies. These are the kinds of paradoxes, the aporias that we see in play when we study refugee carcerality, refugee contexts. But they are also worse than this, because many of the people, as you well know, many of you online at the moment, because you've had experiences of this, these are the kinds of places that when we in what's often called the North or the West are done with these brand new swanky containers, will sell these as second-hand or third-hand to authorities wanting easy prisons in the South. Easy places to incarcerate people, not 14, but maybe 40, maybe 100 to a container, to have spaces which might be used as torture chambers, but are used for different kinds of harm, gradations of harm to the ones being used here by the French government. And so you can imagine that if you come from a context where that has been used upon you, to be placed back into one of those places is far from a trauma-informed practice, is far from secure, is far from enabling people to live well in those spaces. These carceral conditions are managed, and they are managed very deliberately. And we see this in everyday bordering prison discourses. And our colleague Boruz Bachani, who wrote what I think is probably one of the most important pieces of literature in the 21st century, and certainly of prison literature in the 21st century. Boruz Bachani, the Kurdish refugee who was offshored to Manus Island and wrote the book No Friend But the Mountains, writes in that book, I mean, he writes in brilliant ways, but he talks about the Manus prison logic of domination. And he says this domination is one where you will see 5 people needing to leave the dining area so that 5 people can take the place. And the community of those who have to wait to take their place until 5 people leave are controlled by the officer, who will allow the next 5 people to come in just with his finger, the flick of a finger, giving permission to enter. And he says we are like puppets on a string, put in motion with the flick of a finger. Every mind is caught up in a process that has become normalized, a domesticating process. And Barus talks about this as being thought which has been developed in security studies and in management studies, how to manage bodies, how to be carceral with bodies, how to give control to street level bureaucrats and people employed by the security industry to make people know where their place is and that their every movement, their eating, their sleeping, their times of rising and their times of going to bed, their times of eating, their permissions to use the bathroom, that these are all controlled often with the flick of a finger, but that we are complicit within academia of coming up with logics like this and selling them and outsourcing them and developing them and training people to think in these ways, which it gives us all, I think, pause for thought, whether we've been working in this field for 30 years or are newly doctored. And he says, and this is Barus in a conversation with myself in New Zealand, just after he was just after he'd claimed asylum in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where he gave an absolutely electrifying talk in Morningside Methodist Church in Otago. And you can see just behind him, there's the shape of a cross, which I find really moving because it's one of the crosses made from the boat that sank 10 years ago to the week, drowning about 80% of the Eritrean refugees and the Sudanese refugees who were on board that ship. And so we were having this conversation, remembering those in our own families who had drowned in that disaster. But Barus says that the places most like detention camps are airports, hospitals, and universities. Airports, hospitals and universities. And I'd like to just share a poem that I wrote about this process of us in universities being border guards now, and in the way that also academic landlords are required to be border guards. You know, people offering employment are now outsourced to be free agents of the state, reporting regularly as part of our duties of border guarding in whichever place we find ourselves in. So this securitization is outsourced everywhere. So he says we're all border guards now. And this is a poem that I wrote about that process. And it's quite a tough one, so please bear with me. The academic border guard. And they will say of me that despite it all, I was a border guard, that I assigned my name to the papers which monitored and revealed the whereabouts of students from other lands and whose learning was in my care. And they will have evidence when they look again, once again, at the only question we can ever have of history. How did this happen? How did human beings do this? And they will say it of me and of my friends, and also of those who comply easily and don't question as I do daily. They will also say it to those who made the new rules gleefully, rejoicing in expulsions. Maybe they will look at my practices of resistance, but I doubt it. The weighing of evidence is rarely that subtle in matters of life and death, such as implicate me now. Maybe they will read the minutes of the Graduate Studies Committee of 2007, where we all said no. Maybe they will examine my chaotic filing system, my resistance to demands, the way I spoke to those I'm to sign off. But I doubt it. Maybe they will find my accuracy will be wanting. But that is probably not my way, even if I might wish it to be so. If justice comes quickly, hopefully they will say it to my face. It will help with the healings, the clearing away of the detritus of the past. If there's forgiveness in the future, the one for which I work and pray, then perhaps they'll say it kindly and see that on balance, I was only doing my job. These, of course, are the words which haunt me most. But if truth be told, my truth be told, every time I sign my name, I know my guilt and shame and believe that when the day comes and the question is asked and the just verdict falls, for every form filled out and signed, you should spit in my face, and if I am dead, then desecrate my grave with my guilt. Necropolitics. Achille Mbembe wrote a book called On the Post-Colony in 2003. And in that book, he spoke about this politics of death that I'm describing. And he said, my concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. The material destruction of human bodies and populations. And we see this materialized in these image from Lampedusa from 10 years ago of members of our families and our communities who had sought to claim asylum and who were granted refuge after they had died. And we see this in the way that this event has become an endless source of work for artists and activists and scholars who have needed to think through these aporias that are present in everything we have seen experienced, and in the thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths that we have seen since, and which we know now are the will of our governments to perpetuate and see, because make no mistake, the small boats and the deaths are required by a politics of death that lives off necropolitics for it to be sustaining itself. And that is our problem. So that's my miserable start, and it's not a happy start, and it's even unhappier at this moment in time, this moment when we are waiting and hearing and listening for the results of hope that we're placing in a Supreme Court. And my question really is asked alongside two of my favourite thinkers at the moment, David Graeber and David Wengrow, an anthropologist and an archaeologist. David Graeber, the late great David Graeber, a prolific writer, an anarchist anthropologist, who's written beautifully of the potency and potentiality and possibility that he sees generated everywhere in the world in the anthropological record, but also with his friend David Wengrow in the archaeological record of people who survived and made life in really weird and wonderful and amazing ways, and survived times far worse than these. Or times that were better than these, but with their own challenges. Their book, which took them over 10 years to write, called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, is not holding back in its ambition or its title, as you can tell. Rebecca Solnit, who's one of my favourite thinkers of today, calls it a radical revision of everything. And Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls it an intellectual feast. And honestly, it was my book of the year last year. It's sustained me through many a struggle. And they're really talking about shifting our discourse from thinking about inequality or even rights, those liberal benchmarks of who we are and what we latched onto during the Enlightenment as liberal thinkers in particular, to a radical understanding of freedom, a radical intellectual projects, and a radical pursuit of joy, so that we might move towards what they call a more accurate and hopeful a hopeful history of humanity. Much of the work comes out of their ability to undertake and look at the archaeological record that came as the world opened up into globalization, almost ironically, but particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Most of our archaeology, most of our World Heritage sites, as my colleagues Tawana and Hiab have recently been speaking of in the World Heritage Forum, most of them are in the global north, as we call it, rather with a rather sloppy definition of geography. And they have really just said, no, look, if you look at the evidence, literally, if you look at the evidence, there's a completely different story. And this story we've told ourselves of, progress from hunter-gatherers to farmers to a civilization as we know it, through coloniality and the necessity of all kinds of violence. It's just mostly wrong as a theory of the human race. It's extremely dangerous because of what it gets mobilized to do. And my favorite of their descriptions of what it is unnecessarily dull. And as someone who loves a laugh and who loves joy and who thrives on those practices with others, and who knows that there's really nothing better than sitting at table with friends and telling stories and knowing that we've survived and we've made it to this day at this time in this place, then the joyful, hopeful resistances that they theorize and write of, I think for me are the benchmark of intellectual work for the next 20 years to come. And their work is very much an invitation to us all. It isn't a once and for all ambitious document. You know, they know there are holes in it. They know there are things that need working on, but they want something that will be an invitation to us to think in these ways, to think towards a more accurate and hopeful history of humanity. So one of the examples of this, these are two of my colleagues. This is my colleague Tawana and my colleague Gamali. And this is us just crossing the border from Ghana into Togo. That's me standing in Togo in my bare feet with my colleague Tawana. And that's my colleague Gamali, who had written the letters to allow us to travel to that country, going, no, don't cross the border. But what we love about this is how borders can be. It was literally just the crossing over a road into a ditch in a field where there was elephant grass. And borders can be like this, and borders have often been like this, just the ditch, just a way of crossing into a field. They do not need to be these violent imaginaries that we have constructed so far. And there are still places in the world where they're not like that, and where we are able to move, where we might need some care, particularly around our own bodies and around questions around biological risk of contamination that can come with the movement of products, which we often give such free rein to, but where there are more hopeful ways of looking at how we managed one another's crossings into one another's lives. This is where I think that decolonizing is an important element, and that I think it is indeed an epistemological task for us all, that I believe, and I've written about this like this, saying that it's about changing human relationships around power and speech and language, and that to decolonize language, that languages themselves is ultimately about creating quite primal ceremonial actions of cultural safety in the soft symbols of the speaking animal body of the human, that it's not just a task of epistemology, it's a task of ontology. And here I really draw also on and side with the work of Bayo Akomolafe, who's written really about the need for us to engage in ontological resistance, to say there are other ways of being in the world than the ones we are told are given and natural, because they're not given and they're not natural, and many have lived in different ways over many years. So to give an example of this, and to show some work, and this is work I've done with my colleague Hiab and Tawana, but also around with colleagues in semi-autonomous projects in the Gaza Strip, in Zimbabwe, in Morocco, in Mexico, in Ghana, and with people who have sought asylum in the UK. It's work which was cut by the UK government the day after it was launched by 80% as part of the Global Challenge Research Fund cuts. And we worked for over 9 months to campaign very hard, a very small group of us, to have that money restored, and to make sure that our partners in those countries were able to continue to do their work, even though we in the UK were not able to do that. And we have to thank the University of Glasgow for stepping in and continuing to pay the wages of our colleagues in those countries I've mentioned at that time. And not to thank the UK Research Institute that funded us for that particular period of 9 months when we were defunded, apart from the 20% of our time that we were able to use to sustain some small new projects that went on. What we found from it was that joy is counterproof. Joy continues in the worst of circumstances. So this project was a project called CUSP. It stands for Cultures of Sustainable and Inclusive Peace. And it worked with women who are usually women and girls who are usually the first to receive the violence, and who have to often swallow and be quiet about the violence. We were hearing from an Iranian woman last night about the violence that she experienced and experiences, and the way that if women speak out about the violence that they have experienced in that regime, that they will be potentially sentenced to death, that just for being a recipient of violence could be a death sentence in and of itself in this world. And we wanted to look at the way in which women make peace in these contexts, in which women find ways of resisting and holding that pain in and through their bodies, and do it collectively. So this image you can see is made by women from Mexico who formed a collective. And in this collective, they realized that women who have been killed for the non-crime, but perceived as crime by men, of existing as women, for what we call femicide, and where their deaths were not documented or recorded anywhere by the state, got together to make a policy document as a quilt that is enormous. As you can see, it stretches the full length of a really big room. It would fall from a tower block to the ground. And each one is an image of nature and an image of a woman and a word and a name made by people embroidering together and then creating a quilt together. And that's used in a ceremonial action where only the women can touch the cloth. The men can help carry it in a suitcase, but the women must unwrap it. And then this is shown, and it is shown to cries of pain and cries of resistance and cries of determination, but also cries of joy that these women's names are remembered, and remembered in a way that is enduring and can live and can move and can travel across borders in suitcases, as it did when it came from Mexico to the Ghana, and was witnessed by people from the Gaza Strip and Zimbabwe, and from Morocco and Ghana alike, as well as members of the United Nations and the ministries in Ghana, when we showed them this work, powerful work, important work, but work which is symbolic, so needs us to think in many ways, in plural ways around it. It isn't a proposition, it is an offering, maybe even a gift. In doing this work, we've seen, and this is an image from a woman in my city, a statue from a woman in my city who organized a resistance during the Spanish Civil War, where the inscription on the image says, "Better to die on your feet than live forever on your knees," the woman known as La Pasionara. But we're thinking here around ways in which we can achieve a degree of cultural justice and make that for ourselves out with the courts, but in our own courting of, and I use that word advisedly, courting of the powers of eros, the powers of creativity of life, of aliveness against the necropolitics. So an erotic politics and eros politics and eros ethics that says we are alive, or we celebrate what was an aliveness of these women ourselves. And in celebrating this aliveness of the women themselves, we're doing the work of what Adriana Cabrera, the great Italian thinker, has called an inclination, a leaning in towards one another collectively, to listen and to hear. And she speaks of the din of the realm, and of tells a story of a miserable king who was so bored and so lethargic and so sick of hearing the policy wonk talk that we hear all the time, that he opened his window. And when he opened his window in his sadness and his desperation for something that might enliven him and give him hope in what he felt like was just the necropolitics of death all around him in his own realm, created maybe by his own actions and those of his courtiers who were courting death and telling him stories of death, which were supposed to tell him the story of his power, he suddenly heard, alive and bodily, unique and unrepeatable, overcoming with her simple, sonorous truth the treacherous din of the realm, a woman singing. And that ability to hear a woman's song can be an aliveness against death. It can puncture our words and our languages and tell something else. Vadavana Vestaria, Obadia, Obadia, Vadavana Vestaria, Obadia, Monya. That's a song that was sung traditionally from the islands in the north of Scotland. It's in a dialect from Shetland, and it was sung by women as their men went out to sea and might never have come back. It's a song of lament, but it's a song that sings of a still aliveness, of a hope. It pierces the treacherous din of the realm as a woman sings of a truth that we can hear. So I want to just go through a couple of the examples of this work. Here you can see this cloth again, utterly beautiful, hanging from a tower block inside the Center for Migration Studies. And in the work in Mexico, the women, as I said, were using collective work with women and girls to really try and develop new institutions for sustainable development, and working through culture and arts to transform minoritized group and to promote the women's rights, but particularly their autonomy, their collectivity, their empowerment when they weren't heard and seen. In Zimbabwe, we were looking at women who were impregnated, through domestic violence, often as underage girls in their homes, and talking about femicide as well, and using theatre. Theatre is something that people might come together to see, to educate, to raise awareness of the violence against women, especially sexual violence, but also looking at the consideration of dance and theatre and even cultural sport as a benefit for mental health that we can do now. In doing those things, we are alive, we are celebrating, we are showing tensions between church and globalization, tradition and family, all these demands, and how theatre can actually enact these and show these. In Morocco, we were looking at the role of religion in curtailing the freedom of women to be part of their own economic solutions to their own economic spaces. And a wonderful film was made of women speaking out in the presence of men who were silent about ways they found of selling their wares, selling what they've made in markets, and re-energizing a market understanding. And markets, of course, are not the same as global capital. It can be really beautiful, empowering, exciting places, especially for women as market traders. So Morocco was looking at the work like that. And in the Gaza Strip here, you can see an amazing picture of the women who were able to celebrate theatre in the occupied Palestinian territories, ushered along by Nahwa, an arts organisation, and where women led a theatre project to perform their stories, but also engaged in a program of short story writing, learning from people who are really good short story writers working at the Islamic University of Gaza to learn to write short stories for their children themselves, and how men conducted research where they, in their own words, said, look, we don't really think there's much domestic violence in the Gaza Strip. And then when they were talking to women, they were like, oh my goodness, there's so much violence against women here that we need to think about on so many different levels, including the military aggressions we experience almost daily. And so writing became a way of writing back. And some of these women have had their stories selected for publication in major publications like the New York Times, and are going on to do some really wonderful work and produce it, and alongside a guide to researching with women who've experienced violence. In Ghana, we saw a long-term partnership that we've had with the Noyam Institute for African Dance, and an utterly beautiful production that came that was really helping communities that are set against each other or politically at loggerheads during electoral campaigns, thinking through and using dance to really look at a conflict that has started that's interreligious around environmental degradation and the impact on Indigenous female farmers, and how dance can be used to show and tell that story, but also using the resources of tradition and family and religion to tell those aporias that I spoke of before, but actually show the necropolitics and then this eros ethics that can come out of the work. So I hope what you can hear from me in this work is that we're not shying away from what I often call the bowl of tears in our work. We're not shying away from the woundedness of what we do, that we are engaging in an intentional multilingualism, trying to enable people to speak in their own idioms and their languages, which includes the language of the arts, in intentional artistry, in intentional movement building and following Bayo Akinmolafe, in fugitivity, in finding fugitive spaces, that we're intentionally improvising our practice. We don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. Today was a new set of challenges. Even as I woke at 5 o'clock this morning, in my inbox was the next challenge I have to follow, the next way we have to think creatively, the next thing we have to do, the next set of ways at a national and a local level. I, as a scholar, need to be thinking fugitivity and fugitively as a way of saying, how do we keep people safe, but in a way that is celebrating the life we want to live now, in the now, for the future, keeping it alive in the way that, and I know that in a few minutes' time, we will know the results of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2023, who that might be, what their work has been, as a way of making peace in the world and following that declaration that also UNESCO holds by. A problematic prize, but an important one nonetheless, a one that's been given to people sometimes we find problematic, but often whose words have inspired our work. But most importantly for me at the moment, this is work that is drawn from my own source of joy. People often say to me, how is it how is it that you're able to keep going and keep on keeping on with all the work that this requires, with all the many wounds that you bear yourself and bear with others and for others, with all the many ways in which you are set back and challenged and resisted? How is it that you keep going? And my answer is my garden and my allotment. And anyone who follows me on social media knows my love of that, but also doing that work with the next generation, with my grandchildren. And through that, I've really come to appreciate the philosophies of permaculture drawn from Indigenous thinking and drawn from my own understanding of anyone who creates refuge and seeks refuge, having had a place and an indigeneity of their own in the past, so that a permaculture design is needed every day, every minute in all that we're doing. It needs to be a way of living and breathing as part of the work we do, but also a place of intentionality, a place of pausing to redesign our work according to that. So Akamalafe speaks of fugitivity as moving us into a close relation to different speculative unbecomingness of things, the unraveling of things. We need to, as Simone Weil has said, decreate ourselves. And in this future, he says, words will fail. Undeterminiverse is his word, a really difficult word, but we can't determine what it's going to be like. We're still figuring it out ourselves, and we're still figuring out what it might be. I think that's a really good description of Graeber and Wengrow's work as well. They're still figuring it out, but they've invited us to join, to try and find a new language that's a little less dull and a little more exciting, and to find ways we might speak of this. And I'd really encourage you to listen to Bayo Akamalafe. He's doing a lot of work podcasting, as that belongs to a more oral, acoustic epistemology than the one we normally work with, a way of knowing. And then decreation, Simone Weil's brilliant understanding of the need for those of us who've been part of traditions of violence, and that includes all of us, my friends, whether we see ourselves as survivors and victims or perpetrators, and ancestors of violent legacies. But all of us will need to undo the creature in ourselves, that creature enclosed in self and by self. To undo self, one must move through self to the very inside of its definition, that we need to know that those seeds of violence are there, and think about how we unravel our knitting. And knitting is a thing I love to do, or how we re-sow our garden in a way that is sustainable for the work that we do. We've come to some tentative conclusions in our work, and we've published these with UNESCO around gender-based violence, around arts, and I'm currently in the process of doing that around intercultural dialogue and cultural work, and also on multilingual education in a major report for UNESCO. But we know that an opening must be possible beyond boundaries as they've been constructed. We know that the local context is where life happens, and this needs careful observation and description. We know we need to break with the harmful stereotypes, and we need to listen in hard to those who name their worlds in their idioms and allow a translation in the whole of the world's languages, for a granularity of understanding that can address, yes, gender-based violence, but all the violences that beset us. We need sense checking and rehearsal of intercultural dialogue methods, and also the sorts of methods of permaculture that I'm using. We need to reset and check ourselves every year. We need to take feedback on what's grown and what hasn't in real time. We need third terms around which we can cluster, and that is where the arts, I think, can really offer us something important to mediate. And this work has to occur in very brave spaces, which we work together with people who are trained in dialogue, people who are respected elders, people who know how to keep things safe. And those are often unusual people who we haven't necessarily asked to join us in this work, where we've relied so much on a particular narrow definition of management expertise. And they need to be frameworks that are reparative in what we do, and where permaculture can make for sustainable peace. So drawing this to a bit of a close, for me, Kenmure Street, to Kenmure it as a verb, is one of the local places to Glasgow where we saw something become of global resonance, where we saw people just say, these are our neighbours. We won't be bound by these understandings of borders. And this chant, these are our neighbours, turned into a song now by our friend and colleague Penny Stewart, sung by the Maryhill Integration Network, Voices Choir, the Joyous Choir, as they are known, has really helped reset a little and recalibrate some of our understandings about fugitivity and those harder edges of process, but also the places of standing with, but also allowing court processes to take their way. And obviously you probably caught up on the case recently of one of the people who chained themselves to the van, who was acquitted after making a defence in the Sheriff Court in Glasgow. So joy and resistance from below, coupled with those legal processes, those clever processes that we engage in, and allowing people to stand up, maybe allows us to say, as we did in Zimbabwe at this time last year, with the people who run the literature festival in Zimbabwe, one of Africa's premier literature festivals, that we are joy. And that's an ontological resistance by saying we are joy. We will make an ontological declaration in the face of epistemic injustice and historical trauma and continuing trauma that we are joy. That, as Andrade said, when liberation theology was developing, that joy is counterproof, that there is a space for defiance and resistance, and that the old and the new language of peace work will be one which is erotic in those widest senses of the words, one which is generative and restorative of life in the face of death. Graeber and Wengrow draw on Gregory Bateson, who wrote about schismogenesis, which really means the way in which, when things are very bad, when people are doing things in one way and we disagree with it, we will create the opposite. And that's why you can often see opposites coexisting next to each other along different lines, why it can look very different. And we're seeing some of this happening in our movements and in the polarity. There's a real danger in that, but there's something about living out a hospitality to schismogenesis as difficult, impure, imperfect, a ragged, resistant thing, through radical creativity, through the destituting of violence, which isn't about saying we'll get you to agree, not about saying our argument will win over yours, not about might over right, but actually saying we'll agree to be adult about this. We'll be more grown up. We'll have a conversation which says right now, in this generation, at this moment in time, we might not be able to find a solution. But following Paulo Freire's work, we will say that we can love despite disagreement, that love can be about things we disagree with, that it can be like I think I have seen in my witnessing and alongsideness in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where two different treaties exist, two different versions in two different languages, the O Te Tiriti or Waitangi and the Treaty of Waitangi, where people have said we will agree to disagree, but we will find a way of coexisting under treaty. We will be people of the treaty, and that means that we will not know, we will not be able to determine which treaty this is, but we will work this through, because this is the loving thing to do. We don't often talk about love easily in our philosophical conversations, but Paulo Freire said that love is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is a commitment to others, and he placed love centrally in his work of education and the work he called us to try and practice, and is very much what we are trying to find a way of doing within that. We find that when this happens, following Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, that bit by bit, we find ourselves living in a new world. And that's very much my witness to you, my testimony to you, if you like. And that this new world is not given whole any more than the new self is given whole abruptly in psychotherapy, as Brueggemann says, but it's a bit at a time. It's a seminar at a time, a poem at a time, a song at a time, a healing at a time, a pronouncement at a time, a law, a ruling at a time, a tiny victory at a time, one promise, one commandment
Alison.
at a time. Hello?
If you can finish in 10 minutes, then we can
easily. I'm on to my last slide. Thank you, Samson. Thank you. In fact, I think this might be nearly me, because this at the moment is my big sign of hope, and it's huge, as you can see on screen. This is a gourd or a squash or a pumpkin, you might call it. And when we were having our UNESCO Spring School last year, this was a tiny seed which was given out by two wonderful scholars, Astrid and Deirdre, who are now our elders in residence within the UNESCO chair team. And they work down on the South Coast with people who sought asylum and refuge. And they came to us and they gave us a book list of things to read. And then they said, put it away, don't touch it. You can read that later. What we want you to look at and touch are these seeds. And they gave us seeds from squash that they'd grown in their community garden. And they said, we want you to think about who can help you grow as many of these seeds as possible, to make many squash and many more seeds, and to share these, because there is abundance. There is restorative possibility. We can do this, and this is a symbol of it. So this one's mine. It's on my allotment. This one's the one that grew. There are others that grew, but this is the best and the biggest. And I'm amazed because I've never been able to grow squash on the allotment before, and I haven't put it in the right place. There isn't enough sunshine where it is, but there will be seeds, and I will be able to dry them and give them away, and I will have some food from this. But I know that others who are better at this than I have managed to enable these seeds to reach countries where there's real hunger, and to plant these seeds, and that they're spreading and growing really rapidly, and that there are gourds and squash aplenty from those seeds that these people shared. This cost nothing, and yet it's a symbol of what we're talking about here: place, possibility, permaculture overall. So finally, I want to end with a quotation from Bertolt Brecht, who I go back to very regularly. He was an exile, a refugee. He was a playwright. He was a difficult man. I don't think was at all easy to work with or live with, particularly not for women. But he wrote extraordinary pieces of theatre and poetry: poetry of exile, poetry of hope, poetry which tells us there's a way forward. In German, he wrote: Ein kleines Haus unter Bäumen am See, vom Dach steigt Rauch. Fehlte wie trostlos dann wären Haus, Bäume und See. A tiny house under trees by a lake. From the chimney there is smoke rising. If it was not there, how desolate would be the house, the trees, the lake. Without the smoke going up the chimney, there's no hospitality, there's no life, there's no storytelling, there's no cooking, there's no food, there are no meals to tell, and there's no singing around the fireside. I've just come from my favorite time of the month, which is a 2-hour session with what I call my fire pit, where all of the students who have studied with me for PhDs in the past, and those studying with me at present, come together, and we come together to warm ourselves against the cold and the dark, and to tell our stories of hope. And today those were stories which may be understood as poetry, because what we talked about was placing wet socks on smoke alarms, was dead whales on beaches, was trees planted, which are plane trees, which are the trees of the future. We talked about the renaming of people as chariots of peace, as Camus dormitory snorers, as people who are proletariat warriors and champions. We spoke about the way that people might come to a different well and be nourished and restored. We made space for this different idiom that I and that Bayo Akomolafe speak of as necessary for articulating our hopes and our fears and our survival within these spaces. It's poetry. It is a poetic space. It is uncomfortable. And it's not one where we are easily going to be able to make narrow careers, but it is one that is sustaining and regenerative and collective. It's one where that even in dark times, to answer the question that Brecht asked, there will be singing. There might be singing about dark times, but that voice of song that is the great breath coming out of the body will be sustained and will be sustainable. And with that, thanks to Samson, I will close my talk and unshare my slides. Thank you to you all for listening.